Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. We hope we have a great session. It's going to be a conversation with people that really know different aspects of higher education, but all of them share one thing in common, which is they pretty much know all of the major issues that have been discussed. They may come down on different sides of the questions, which is what we hope for, because we want to have a good discussion. Obviously, there are no easy answers to the challenges facing higher education. My name is John Nelson. I'm with Moody's Investor Service, and you may wonder why a bond rating analyst is leading a panel or moderating a panel on higher education. And I can only say there's maybe two reasons for that. One is the reason that I think some of my colleagues would want me to say is I look like a professor, I pontificate like a professor, and I nevertheless am a pretty good teacher. But I think the reason that Milken asked me is because I've spent 20 years analyzing colleges and universities and seen tremendous changes in the industry from an economic perspective, and it's, I think, enabled my team to draw some insights about the economics of the industry and where it might be heading. But more importantly, our panelists. I think many of you know our panelists. I'll begin with Bill Bennett. Bill was, as you know, Secretary of Education in the 1980s in Washington and has done a wide variety of other things. He's an author of many best-selling books, and he has a new book out called Is College Worth It? And there will be a book signing after this, and you can get the details. We'll give a plug at the end for where you can do that if you want to attend that. Bill's also involved in Udacity, which is an important venture in higher education. Stephen Knapp is the president of George Washington University. George Washington is one of the, I think, one of the most dynamic universities in the private nonprofit sector. Over the last 20 years, it's really transformed itself in many ways, and Steve is seen as a leader, certainly among the private research universities in the country. Daphne Koller is the co-founder of Coursera, and she's from Stanford. Daphne plays a very interesting role as both somebody who's a supporter of higher education, but also somebody who's involved in change in a way that some people consider disruptive, although I don't think Daphne would necessarily describe it that way. Patricia McWade is the Dean of Student Financial Services at Georgetown, so she has a real insider's view on student loans, affordability, financial aid, and what's driving the changes that really cause a lot of the public attention to higher education. And then finally, last and certainly not least, Tony Miller. Tony is the Deputy Secretary and Chief Operating Officer of the Department of Education. And this Department of Education arguably has been as involved or more involved in new regulatory initiatives as well as sort of jawboning and working on higher education costs, affordability, access, productivity, and graduation. All topics that have been bubbling up for a long time in higher education, but now appear to really be rising to the surface in a major way in Washington. So the only thing I want to say at the beginning before I ask panelists to give their views and to have a conversation is when you think about U.S. higher education, from one perspective, you could say, what's the problem? Every global ranking out there of universities in the top 20, 75% of them are U.S. universities, generally seen as the number one place in the world for students from other countries to attend to get a college education. So from that perspective, it's probably one of our greatest industries and our greatest export industry. But measured from other things that really people care more about closer to home and less macro and aggregate issues, cost and affordability, poor and declining graduation rates, rising student loan burdens, and rising student loan defaults. And really, for the first time in the last few years, pretty dramatic falls in public opinion surveys on whether or not college is worth it. So these are all pretty challenging times when you focus on those. That's really the topic of our panel today, is how to deal with those challenges. So if there are challenges, one would think that there has to be change. And one question that we as a panel agreed beforehand we would talk about is what will force change? Who will force change? And thinking of that broadly, whether it's process, technology, regulation, markets, I'd like to ask Bill if he would kind of start off on that topic of who will force change on higher education. Bill?
Okay, thank you. Good to be here. You're just asking me because I don't look like a professor. But I was a professor of philosophy. But in all my government jobs, I was mistaken not as the chairman of the National Endowment or the Secretary of Education. I was almost always taken as the security for the chairman or the secretary, which fine by me. I finally got to be drug czar and got to be a cop, so that was okay. I think from the perspective, which I'll try to have most of the morning, of taxpayers and students and parents, I think they're going to force some change. Public opinion is shifting, as you said, on higher education, on the value of it. Some 82% of public thought it was a good idea to go to college about 20 years ago. Now it's about 57%. Students are pointing this out. There was a story yesterday, I saw it on Morning Joe, and down there at the exercise machine, it's a young woman who graduated from Utah State and has become a web sensation saying, "Send cash, no job." And I think parents may even do this. It would be a stretch for parents to stop believing in college because they've been doing it for years, been paying whatever college has asked, been putting more family members to work in order to pay for college. But they are now, as they kiss their children at graduation and are not seeing them go off to jobs perhaps, but saying your room in the basement is ready. Well, why am I saying this? Because let's talk about one other pressure point, which is legislation being introduced by Ron Wyden, Democrat, and Marco Rubio in Florida. Know as you go, I think it is, or something like that. They want colleges to disclose what their graduation rate is. Why? Did you know that 46% of people who start four-year colleges don't finish? They just don't finish, 46%. A lot of them are on student aid and scholarships and for funding and so on. They want the colleges to say what their employment rate is for their students by discipline. Do you know that in the class of 2011, 50% of those people who graduate in 2011 are either unemployed or dramatically underemployed. We have 115,000 janitors with BAs. Janitor's a great job, but that's not why most people went to college. And they want to know what they're really going to be, what their debt's going to be, how much they're going to owe. A lot of colleges, as we say in the book, hide how much you're going to pay for. And in little briefings we've seen to college admissions officers or financial aid officers who go to the campuses, they will say, emphasize we'll take you to the stars and all that. Don't emphasize how much they're going to owe when they graduate. And that debt is now, as you know, John, $1 trillion. A lot of people think this is the next bubble. It may be. So I agree with you. It is the world's greatest educational system. I remember, and I'll close with this on a positive note, having pointed out these problems among many others. When I was Secretary of Education, a lobbyist came to see me with a representative from the People's Republic of China. He said, we have 150 graduate students from China who come to American universities to do postdocs in physics and math and so on. And we lose about 70 of them a year because they defect to the United States. We want you to do something about it. I said, absolutely. We want them all. And we are going to get on this right away. Less defection these days. The Chinese are building up their universities. But you bet, if you want the greatest education in the world, and not just in math and science, but I noticed this at NEH. If we were doing an international conference on Portuguese literature and had 20 scholars, 10 of them would be from the United States. We have subsidized this, we have paid for it, private money has paid for it, the taxpayers have paid for it, and we have created some wonderful institutions and wonderful faculty. But we got a ton of people in college who are not getting, I think, what they deserve. Taxpayers are not getting the truth about a lot of things, and there's a lot of disappointment and frustration, and that will start driving things like this legislation.
Thank you, Bill. So, Tony, I think, following up on Bill's comments, from the perspective that you sit in Washington, certainly it appears the Department of Education under the Obama administration is at least as assertive, if not more assertive, in terms of focusing on a lot of the topics that Bill mentioned. Can you bring us up to date on the thinking at the Department of Education on some of these issues on cost, access, affordability, productivity?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the question is, what do you really expect of your higher education system, especially over the next 10 years? And we think our current system, as good as it is, needs to continue to evolve to meet the current needs and the future needs, and it's on a number of different dimensions. One, we've got a significant issue with pure productivity. As Bill said, if you think about a cost per completed degree, our statistics are not compelling at all, and that contributes to the overall debt burden. So it's not just, if you will, the list price, but it's also the fact that you have poor productivity. So you have many students not actually completing a degree and/or taking more time, incurring more cost to complete that degree. So how do we actually attack that problem? The other reality is we have a tendency to think about higher education and the degrees in a too monolithic way. Many of us have this traditional notion of a four-year degree as kind of the path. And that is absolutely true. The statistics have been clear that on average, the lifetime earnings differential between a high school graduate and somebody with a bachelor's degree is about $1 million over the lifetime. So the importance of higher education has never been greater. But it's also true that almost 30% today, 30% of high school graduates will earn more than people with an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree. So occupation and what you study and what you actually study matters. And this has been work that's come out of Tony Carnival and others at Georgetown is one example. And that's contributed to what we see as kind of a middle skills gap. And so there's a host of jobs out there, 11 million of recent record, that project that we don't have enough qualified kind of candidates for those jobs, which need beyond just a high school degree, but something short of a four-year baccalaureate. So how do you get a real recognized credential that employers are going to value? How do we do that cost effectively? A big challenge we have. As we need to bring up the educational attainment of a broader population, if we're going to, again, Lowell Milken had statistics yesterday that said the value of human capital was something like $184 trillion worth of GDP value in terms of in this country. I mean, that's staggering. And so if we don't invest in raising the bar for everybody, so that means access. We also know that our K12 system, as much as we're working to improve it, that even if we're wildly successful, we are still requiring higher ed to remediate for the lack of preparedness of many students, order of magnitude of, it's been estimated, upwards of $3 billion. So what we're trying to do is, I think, catalyze and enable the kinds of changes that we think are needed, recognizing that at the end of the day, we're limited and respectful of our role. What's that mean? One, we want to drive definitely transparency. So the kinds of initiatives that say, how is the higher education system performing at the institutional level, at the degree level, in terms of cost, completion rate, earnings rate, return on investment type? How do we make much more transparent that information so parents and students can make more informed choices? Two, how do we catalyze industry to get more engaged? Because what I would say one of the key stakeholders in this that could really drive some of the reforms is industry. Industry values, right, to the degree that they start valuing some subsegment of the traditional degree and give that validity, that will accelerate change. And so how do we better engage industry on what are the kinds of industry recognized standards that we could then enable with our student aid financing? So those are some considerations, more competency-based metrics. We're trying to enable those kinds of reforms. And then I think lastly, as we've seen with some of our regulatory posture, we're increasingly saying this notion of productivity, are you really delivering a return? We are looking at mechanisms where we can, be it statutory or regulatory, where we're holding institutions accountable for delivering a quality product. And that's controversial, but we think the American taxpayers, our debt, if student loan debt reaches $1 trillion, we need to do a much better job of ensuring that that money's being well invested and holding institutional accountable for students, making sure they deliver that. So that is our regulatory and statutory agenda, our overall policy. And it's not to force it. I wouldn't say we're trying to force it, but we're trying to enable it because as I'm sure some of our other panelists are going to talk about, there are some innovative things going on out there, and the question is how do you foster their adoption and scale?
Thank you, Tony. I'm tempted to go to Daphne next because Daphne is involved in the forefront of a lot of things that are exactly what Tony was mentioning as new models out there, new technologies, new processes. But I'm going to instead go to Steve first, and then to Daphne and Patricia. Steve, as you're charged with actually leading one of these organizations, and an organization that has done, I think, in many ways, very well for itself in the last 20 years due to some pretty good strategic decisions that George Washington has made. From where you sit, can you address the question of whether or not higher education can evolve itself, or whether it needs really major disruptive change in order to control costs, improve graduation rates, improve quality measures?
I'll start by saying I don't know what the threshold is between change and disruptive change, but certainly change is always in order. I think the worst temptation of any institution is complacency, and I think that's what any of us find the most frustrating characteristic, not just of universities, but of any institution. And so you have to keep refreshing what you're doing and re-examining it and criticizing it. And competition, of course, is a real driver of that in our system, and I think that's one of the things we don't want to lose. I think we have to be very careful as we look at some of these proposals for the way we measure things, that we don't do that in a way that actually weakens the competitive system that drives excellence across our institutions. I'll say in my own case, I started on August 1st, 2007, my very first day. I met with all the senior leadership of the university, and I said two things. One, we were going to continue to drive the improvement of our instruction and research, but we're also going to get a handle on affordability and access. And we decided, I mentioned several things that day, which we developed over the course of my first year, very much with the collaboration of our Board of Trustees and I think with the support of faculty and others. One of those is we were going to continue a program that started just before I got there of fixed tuition and guaranteed aid, which means that what a family pays when the student first arrives never changes for up to 5 years. So if a student finishes within 5 years, that student never sees an increase in tuition or reduction in financial aid. And in fact, if the family has additional need during that period, the financial aid goes up, but it never goes down, even if their need is reduced. So that guarantee, I think, has given a sense of security to families who are considering, and students and their families who are considering our university in this time of economic uncertainty. And so we're going to continue that. We're also going to moderate the rate of tuition increases. For all 6 years I've been involved in that process, we've kept our costs at 3% or below in terms of the annual increase, a little above inflation, but certainly below the market. At the same time, we decided we were going to make a major effort to bring in more philanthropic support for student aid so we could reduce the burden of debt. And what we've added to that since that first meeting that I had with all my senior leaders was, again, with the support of the Board of Trustees, and actually one of the drivers of that, Trustee Nelson Carbonell, is in the audience today. We created something called the Innovation Task Force. The idea of that was to have a community-wide effort. We had actually two branches of this task force, one on business processes, one on instruction. One of the things I think that really worked was we had a mixture of faculty and staff on both of those. So we didn't have the faculty work on instruction and the staff working on the business processes. And the idea was to identify savings and productivity gains that would be equivalent to the payout on our endowment at that time. So the goal was, over a 5-year period, to identify $60 million in annual recurring savings and productivity gains, so we can invest those in improving the institution without having to do so by raising tuition. Mm-hmm. So that's been a fundamental effort on the part of our university. Mm-hmm. Now I have to say, a very important parameter that I think that has to be put out there is that, institutions like mine, that is private institutions of higher education, are only 27% of the whole higher education market. Public institutions are 73%. And I have to say that when I think about this as a national issue, I'm much more concerned about the situation in public institutions than I am about the situation in private institutions, which are pretty much taking care of themselves. I mean, there are pressures on liberal arts colleges. Universities like mine seem to be holding up in terms of the applications, the ability of students to graduate, all the rest of that. What I'm really worried about is what I see as a massive defunding of public institutions by the governments that have supported them in the past. And I think that that's what's behind a lot of the angst that we see here, because it drives the tuition increases, it drives the replacement of domestic students with more high-paying foreign students, it drives the replacement of in-state students with out-of-state students. That's what I'd really like to see us get a handle on. And maybe I'll conclude by congratulating Daphne, because on sort of a happy birthday, because I think it was just 1 week ago that she celebrated the first anniversary of the creation of Coursera.
That's right.
So,
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
So I have to go to you, Daphne. Daphne has some very interesting views on disruption and change. So Daphne, when you think about Coursera and other either MOOC providers or just generally online instruction, how much of this do you see as an improvement in quality and an expansion of the market through more access for students versus a way to lower the cost per student?
So I think the answer is that obviously it's going to be a bit of both. But first of all, I think it's important to recognize that the higher education and education in general is long overdue for transformation. If you look at every other market sector, transportation, medicine, anything else, and you think about the major innovations that have occurred in that sector in the last 250 years, you'll have a list a mile long. Anesthetics, antibiotics, orthoscopic surgery. What are the innovations that you've seen in education since the invention of the printing press? Movable whiteboards, PowerPoint. I mean, you run out of ideas very quickly when you think about things that have transformed the way that we teach since the printing press. I think what we're seeing today is the first major opportunity that we've had to really transform the way that we teach our students and to leverage technology to improve both quality and access and scalability, which is going to lead to cost reductions. So where do we see that? Does it really make sense to have thousands of instructors go into class every semester preparing from scratch a version of Calculus 1, Physics 1, Chemistry 1? Or does it make sense to utilize technology where we have really great assets that an instructor can leverage and walk into class, and instead of giving the same lecture year after year, spend the time in class getting to know their students, getting to interact with them, getting to home in on the ones that are struggling with a particular concept and help them along so that we can increase our completion rates and thereby reduce the costs per completed degree in order to basically improve all of the outcomes that we care about. Outcomes being employability of the students that emerge because they're better skilled, the fraction of students that emerge, the quality of our system in terms of its ability to serve all of its students. Do you know that, that at the age of 24, if you look at the top quartile of students, the ones that come from the top quartile of income, not quartile of ability, top quartile of income in the United States, the fraction who graduate by the age of 24 is 89%, is 80%, and the ones in the lowest quartile are 11%. So think about that disparity. The highest income, 80% graduating by the age of 24, 11% at the lowest quartile. We're not serving the students who need our help the most. This technology is a mechanism by which we can differentiate the students by the amount of help that we need, devote the resources of our universities and of our instructors to help the students who really need the help, to help the students who are really struggling. And when you make better use of resources, it also improves costs, because you don't end up with a one-size-fits-all education where you spend the exact same amount of time and effort on everyone. You spend the resources where they are best needed. And so I think the answer is that really we're hoping to see technology being used in both of these dimensions.
Thank you, Daphne. I'm struck, I'm going to comment a little bit on Steve's point about the market share of private versus publics and whether change is needed. Certainly, Steve, from our perch where we sit, most of the medium and larger private universities in the country are financially doing quite well. There is some concern in a number of areas, but overall, certainly financially, they're pretty well off. But when you think about, even though they're only 27% of the market collectively, they're probably 2/3 of the CEOs and major government leaders. They're probably 90% of the media coverage on higher education as an industry. And so they have a very powerful place in the industry, which is why students would, certainly in the East Coast, and to some extent in the rest of the country, would have a first choice to go to a leading private university. And Patricia sits in sort of a position at Georgetown, Georgetown is one of those leading, globally known private universities that charges a lot of money for access to the school, and students are willing to borrow a lot of money to attend private universities like Georgetown. So Patricia, when you look at the statistics on rising student loan burden, rising student loan defaults, even at prestigious places, what do you think about the future in terms of the sustainability of that, and whether universities like Georgetown, have a role to play in limiting the amount of money that students borrow? And if so, what would you do about that at Georgetown?
Sure. I think we must limit the amount that students are borrowing, and that $1 trillion number really scares me. At Georgetown, for our undergraduate students, we have made a conscious effort now for over 30 years to limit the amount of indebtedness that our undergraduate students have. And we have a policy we call need-blind admissions, and then we meet full need for our students. And so a typical undergraduate graduating from Georgetown, we hope in 4 years, some in 5, have about $17,000 of indebtedness when they graduate. But about 8 years ago, we realized that we weren't able to attract the very high need students who are first in their families to go to college. And so we set out to fundraise to help reduce the amount of loan we would put in the financial aid package for this group of students. And we now have a program of 530 students this year, 600 next year, of primarily first-generation college-going students who will receive about $5,500 worth of indebtedness, which we think is really manageable. It's allowed us to have students who are first in their families to go to college at Georgetown. What we realized immediately upon doing that was that we needed not just to do loan reduction, but we needed to provide programmatic opportunities for these students. And so we now have a program that helps these students acclimate to Georgetown, and it's just an amazing thing. It's the best thing I've done in my financial aid career, which has been very, very long through these last 40 years to help these kids. But I just wanted to also mention part of the problem with indebtedness is the fact that graduate students borrow so much, and the federal public policy associated with student lending recently allowed graduate students to borrow up to the full cost of attendance for their master's and PhD programs. And so some of these students are borrowing $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 a year because they can. And they use the money not just for tuition, but for living expenses as well. And I think that has added to this notion of this $1 trillion of indebtedness out there. And we hope that students in professional schools like Georgetown's law school, medical school, business school will get good jobs. But I really worry about master's programs in social work and things like that, where students may not be able to repay the amount of indebtedness given their salaries.
Yes. Steve?
I just want to, it's kind of a footnote to that. I do think that's what a lot of us worry about. I'm not, frankly, persuaded by the arguments about the bubble. If you take that $1 trillion in debt and you look at just the undergraduate piece of that, of students that attend private universities, 30% of those students graduate with no debt at all, zero. Of students who attend public institutions, 40% of them graduate with no debt at all, zero. The average for those who do graduate with debt is about $27,000. Now that's not trivial. I mean, it's comparable to an expensive car loan or something. Of course, remember that the differential between college graduates and non-college graduates in annual income is about $22,000. So that's almost equivalent to the total of that loan. What we worry about, though, and I think this is something Patricia just touched on, is the limiting effect that can have on the choices that students make about their futures. We, Georgetown, many of us have the same. We're in the same situation where we attract a lot of students who really want to change the world. They really want to make a difference. They want to go into professions that aren't going to simply be to their own benefit, but will benefit others. We, for 3 years in a row, sent more students to the Peace Corps than any other comparable sized institution. And a lot of our students want to go into that kind of work in the future. But if they've got to pay off the loans, and especially if they accumulate them during graduate school, that becomes an increasing burden on them. So I think that's where I think the pressure really is from our point of view. But I don't think that points to a bubble, to be really frank about this. It is an issue that we want to address, and that's why all of us are trying to find resources that will enable us to reduce that debt level on graduating students.
Thank you, Steve. So, Bill, taking what Steve said and kind of marrying it with the technology angle, I was attended a session yesterday on technology and the learning process, and most of the panelists there were private sector people. There were no university people there. We're pretty much unanimous in their view that technology is going to totally disrupt colleges and universities, and there will be hundreds closing their doors in the next decade. Now, that's not an unusual perspective, I think, from people who are very oriented toward risk. We're investors. They certainly would view the higher education business model as it exists today as sort of a foreign entity, something that doesn't make any sense from an investor's perspective. So their views are maybe not surprising, but on the other hand, I don't think you would have had people saying that 10 years ago. So there's clearly a major shift underway in terms of the issues that Steve raised, as well as the disruptive potential of technology. If you could comment on those topics, that would be great.
Yeah, can we ask, since both the private universities have been mentioned here and their tuitions, what's tuition at GW and Georgetown?
It's what, 40?
42, 43.
42. Yeah, we're almost identical tuition. But of course, as you know,
Sure.
well, Bill, that's the, 2/3 of our students are on student aid. So there's
I understand. I understand.
a minority that pays that.
I'm paying for it. I know. Right?
Unfortunately, not to us, but we appreciate
Yes,
that.
yes, I am. Anyway, it all depends. In part, I mean, just on this, it depends. I mean, there's disaggregate the data. If you're a philosophy major like I was, anthropology major, graphic arts, you get out and you owe $25,000. You may not get married for 10 years because you're not going to get a job. I mean, your odds of getting a job aren't very good. However, if you decide to do petroleum engineering, you can have 3 wives. I mean, you can, or three husbands. I'm sorry, Daphne.
Very good.
Or both. Not that there's anything wrong with that. So, but I mean, the top. We do, return on investment pay scale, the top 10 majors by mid-career earnings, not to be so crass, because I believe in the unexamined life. That's why I went to college and get a PhD in philosophy. Petroleum engineering, starting salary 98, actuarial math 56, computer science 58.4. Graduate of the South Dakota School of Mines makes more than the Harvard graduate, the average Harvard graduate. I'll get to the technology point. I just want to pick up on something Tony said, because it's so important. By the year 2018, that's the numbers I have, I think it's from your department, 14 million jobs will be available that will require more than a high school degree, but less than a college degree. An associate's degree might do fine, particularly in the STEM disciplines. Let me just get in a plug for my favorite organization, Project Lead the Way, which is represented here. These folks work with teachers in the schools at the middle school level and working at the elementary school level, which is where a lot of kids turn off to math and science, just deciding early on they can't do it. And they are producing more and more students taking these subjects and, having at least being in the possibility of getting these jobs. On the technology, look, I think people are right to be a little afraid. Technology universities could be a little bit like Mike Milken coming your way back in the old days and saying, your company may not be very, very efficient. And I think the possibilities are great. But let's remember, all the technology in the world that we've had for 30 years in the elementary and secondary schools hasn't improved American education scores. I think that promise is unfulfilled. I think we should keep trying. But I'm on another company, a board, and that's Udacity, which is, again, Stanford people. We say in the book, by the way, no matter where you are, what your circumstances are, if you get into Stanford, go. I don't care if you have to borrow $100,000, because your return on investment is going to be fabulous. But if you get into both it and the South Dakota School of Mines, it's a close call. But culturally, Palo Alto, I visited with Sebastian Thrun, the founder of Udacity, a few other states other than California. They all wanted him to move there, and he said, I can't possibly leave Palo Alto. This is ridiculous. Anyway, that's another question. But Thrun's experience, professor at Stanford, teaching robotics, put the course online, got 1,200 students, then 1,800 students, then 100,000 students. They did an assessment. We talk about Daphne's point about getting the information to students who otherwise wouldn't get it. One of their top students was a student in Mongolia who took the course online. Otherwise, he's not getting it, okay? He's not going to the University of Mongolia and getting it. Here's what I find so interesting, is that Thrun himself had 400 students, very good teacher in his course on robotics. This guy invented the driverless car, and a great idea for teenagers, seems to me, and robots and so on. The 400 students, first of all, it was at spot 420 before one of his Stanford graduate students showed up in the ratings. There's all these kids from all over the world, places nobody ever heard of. And then a third of the students, when the course was offered online, dropped the in-person course to take it online. Thrun's right there in front of them, and they said, no, we'd rather do it online. Why? A couple of reasons. Because there are some advantages Daphne can tell us about that you don't have. You create a bit of a community. You have people sharing information, helping each other. And the other thing is that, let's remember, this new generation, they are entirely comfortable with this technology. I sent 2 sons to Princeton. They told me most of it was online, and they wouldn't tell me they didn't end up not going to classes. But I know they didn't go to a lot of classes. They were virtually creating virtual courses for themselves. The professors were helping because they like it. They like it too. So I think it's a big deal, and I think it's probably going to happen more dramatically in higher ed than it's happened in elementary and secondary.
Thank you, Bill. Tony?
Sorry, long-winded.
No, I think it's important as you think about these online technologies in higher ed. I think there's a couple different dynamics to it that are going to shape how disruptive it's going to be. One, I think what we've seen that up to now, you've actually seen this notion of online being offered by a subset. But really, it's really been a customer or student acquisition model. It is how can I expand my reach, right, for my existing university full degree program by expanding access. And I think that was effective at really being able to grow, right, with a small bricks and mortar footprint, but you could really grow dramatically by leveraging an online platform. Again, around an institution and a full degree. I think that's being coupled with, and what the Udacities and the Coursera's have proven is, no, how can I take kind of premier content, premier brand universities, and how can I take that at scale, not the full degree model, but a specific kind of subsegment of content. And where the first was limited by still geography in the US, this is going global for a subset. I think it's going to be the combination of those two different dynamics that's really going to shape the disruptive nature to the degree that it is for higher ed. One, I think, as you've seen, the initial institutions, many of them have been the for-profit innovators, trying to drive customer acquisition, increase customer satisfaction, identifying an underserved segment. As mainstream publics start picking up that capability, they will have a set of brand awareness, quality, that they can now extend and drive increased access. And so I think that is going to be significant in terms of where you're going to see a lot of growth, and that's going to have the benefit of taking your fixed cost base and spreading it over a broader student population, which is going to have a real positive impact on productivity. I think complementing that, which the more, some people say the disruptive models, is it's going to say, well, how do we take pieces of what has been the traditional degree, and now does this allow that to be rebundled in a different way for different subsegments, globally, domestically, what are the different combinations of content that are most relevant? I think that's also going to be disruptive, but in a different way. And I think it's important to think about those differently, because I think both those factors are really going to shape what's going to happen over the next 5 years.
Daphne?
I think one of the things that we're experiencing right now is, as compared to a lot of the online programs that Tony just spoke to, is that we have moved away from a perspective of let's take the on-campus experience and try and replicate it as closely as possible in an online format. And when you do that, you lose a lot of the benefits of face-to-face instruction, sort of the direct contact between faculty and students, for example, without gaining very much on the other side except for a certain increase in scalability, and not a huge one at that. What we've done in this new generation is really said, let's think about the online as a completely separate medium. It's no longer an attempt to replicate face-to-face instruction. It's its own thing. And when you do that, you realize that you're giving up some things, but you're also gaining an enormous number of other things. You're gaining an enormous amount of scalability. You're gaining the ability for students to interact with the material at their own time, at their own pace, which is going to allow the weaker students to catch up and the really good students to race ahead. You're gaining the ability to interact with the material in fundamental ways as opposed to just sitting there blankly in a classroom taking notes. You're getting the social networks of students helping each other. The community that's built up in other domains, in Facebook and in other cases, is now being introduced into the realm of education in ways that it has never been before. And by doing that, we're changing the way in which education is offered to our students in a completely fundamental way. And that, I think, is the cause for this disruption that we're seeing right now. Because this new experience is now no longer inferior, and in many ways is superior to the kind of education that we've been able to offer to our students, at least in the large lecture classes. And I think when we get to this point that this new form of education actually offers fairly significant benefits over what we're doing before, that's when we're starting to see the existing models being really threatened and potentially disrupted. And so now the question is, okay, so what is going to happen to these institutions of higher education when there is this different and viable alternative that's emerging? And I think that's something that different institutions are going to have to think about and respond to in different ways. That is, people often ask me, so which are these institutions, those thousands that are going to go out of business? I don't know if it's going to be thousands, but there's certainly going to be a risk to existing institutions. The ones that I think are at risk are the ones that don't engage with this, that don't think about what is the value proposition that they're offering to their students beyond content. Because content is about to become a commodity. Not just content, high quality, the best quality content. And so what do you offer to your students beyond that? And I think there are answers to that question. They're going to be different for different institutions. If you're a community college, for example, the value proposition you offer to your students could be helping them with the skills that they unfortunately should have learned in high school but didn't, and helping them to sort of get to the point they're ready for college level work. If you're a top research university, that value proposition is the ability to engage with some of the top scholars in their discipline and interact with them one-on-one and be mentored and see that as a role model and be involved in the research endeavor. I think other institutions have the opportunity to create networking opportunities, industry internships. There's a whole range of different things that an institution could do, and I think create a real value to its students by bringing them in and letting them work with each other, work with faculty, learn creative thinking, problem-solving skills, and so on. The ones that don't think like that don't realize that they have to provide value beyond the content, those are the ones that I think are going to be at risk in the coming decade.
So Steve, Daphne raised some pretty interesting perspectives. Made me think that I've heard a question that was raised to me a few years ago, which is from one of our corporate people, not at Moody's, but an analyst on Wall Street. What's the difference between this group called the AAUP, which is the American Association of University Professors, which in some campuses plays the role of a union, but collectively it's certainly an association that speaks for faculty employment rights. What's the difference between them and the United Steelworkers in the 1960s? Are they not just sitting ducks, and will this not kind of backfire on them because they're resistant to change, largely due to tenure? And just this week, or maybe it was last week, Amherst College, which is not necessarily a paradigm for what we're talking about, but certainly is a leader in private liberal arts colleges. Their faculty voted down membership in leading MOOC provider. I won't say its name, Daphne. And
Not us.
and yes, not Coursera. So, and Duke University's faculty today said no to a certain type of online venture. So when you think about the university traditional model and faculty, especially tenured faculty, are they really capable of adjusting to the changes that Daphne just laid out?
So I'll tell you what we're doing. I mean, because I'm very interested in everything that Daphne's saying. I think one of the great advantages of this whole, the wide range of experiments that are going on right now. There's no question we're in an era of turmoil, and nobody knows exactly what format or approach is going to be dominant in this market when it finally shakes out. I think we can all agree on that. We're in a nascent stage of this experiment, but I think it does have great promise. One of the things it's going to do is put pressure on faculty at their home campuses to do a better job of teaching and to find more innovative ways of doing that. I think that's a welcome. That goes back to what I was saying about complacency earlier. So I actually welcome that. I think it's a kind of breath of fresh air coming into the institutions. I think there's a lot we can learn about pedagogy. We actually happen to operate an online high school in partnership with a for-profit company called K12, which actually the CEO was here at another panel yesterday, and I think that's an experiment. We want to learn how you do pedagogy related to online instruction at the K through 12 level, because we want our faculty in our Graduate School of Education and Human Development to understand that, so that they can prepare teachers to go out into that world, which that'll also have some feedback effects, I think, on our higher education activities. We're going to be launching a number of ourselves, and we haven't picked a partner yet. I mean, I think you can't read too much into the decision to pick one partner rather than another. We're actually shopping right now, but we're going to be launching between 5 and 10 MOOCs in the coming months. Experimentally, we want to be able to have some analytics around those so that we can figure out what's effective and what isn't. We're going to be looking at all the models that are out there. We created a senior level administrative position, hired a former dean of law school who's very entrepreneurial to run this activity for us. But I'll mention another model, because I think it goes to this question of, is it possible to preserve a core university campus and mission while at the same time increasing access and using this technology to do it? So we're a private university located in Washington, D.C. We just signed a large agreement with all the community colleges in the Commonwealth of Virginia, focused on nursing, and the idea is that qualified students who get an associate's degree in nursing from those community colleges will be able to complete their degree in our School of Nursing, primarily through an online program which will have some face-to-face instruction. So it's a little bit of the flip model that we've been hearing about. The majority of the instruction will be online, some will be face-to-face. One of the great advantages of that, now that's going to help us because it's increasing our tuition base, no question about that. It's an important mission because I think, as we all know, across America, there's a challenge having primary health care in rural communities. And one of the causes of that challenge is that when students go to nursing school, they often tend to stay in the schools, stay in the communities where they go to school. So if they go to Georgetown School of Nursing or our School of Nursing, they might end up remaining in those communities rather than going back to their rural communities. This enables them to stay there while they complete their education, and we're hoping that's going to be of benefit to those rural communities. So I guess the thing to say about this is it looks to me like a sort of triple win situation. It uses the technology, it strengthens our institution, it meets an important social mission, it creates opportunities and access for students across the Commonwealth of Virginia, and it's an unusual example, I would say, of a partnership between a private university and a public college system.
Thank you, Steve. So, Bill, Steve mentioned privates working with public community colleges. Can you kind of expand that and talk about K through 12 and the engagement of higher education broadly with K through 12?
Yeah, I was the first chairman of K12, by the way, Steve. So I know a little about it. Yeah, it's interesting the example that Steve used, because another little nugget here. I was telling Eric Cantor that in his state, Virginia, the graduates of the 2-year program at the Jefferson College of Nursing, kids you're talking about, make more than the graduates of the University of Virginia with the BAs. Now, it may just be temporary, but if you think when we live to 120, we're not going to need more nurses, then it'll be only temporary. I think it'll be more than temporary. I don't think they'll be limiting their income by carrying on their education if you don't mess it up with a lot of philosophy and anthropology, but that seems to predict downward. But I'm still in favor of it, by the way, as long as people know they go in with their eyes open. I asked Tony what he thought. I don't want to tie him to it, but before the session, what we spend in remedial education. It's certainly in the billions, but this is one thing that technology can address. If we did a better job at K-12, we wouldn't have to do so much remedial. I think if the colleges, I do know this from having served secretary, if you're living, breathing, you can go to college. You may not be able to go to Harvard, but you'll be able to go to college. You may even take you if you're not living, because if you're bringing student aid and other stuff, they will take you. Somebody will take you. But real credentials, knowing something, this is a very sensitive topic because we've been beating up on the elementary and secondary schools for a long time about what the kids know, and now we have accountability. Our Secretary of Education is saying we should be able to measure if students are learning before people are rewarded. He's absolutely right. How about college? What are they learning? Most of the studies suggest not much, frankly. They're not learning critical reasoning, other things. Colleges are averse to the notion of assessment, any kind of independent assessment or audit. So I think that could come forward from K12 onto higher ed, and I think that may be part of this package. But precisely, I know in Udacity, I'm sure Coursera is doing this too, they are addressing the remedial problem, and their first big, kind of money down thing is Governor Brown here in the state. They're doing all the remedial education in math, science, and some other disciplines for the junior community colleges, or San Jose State anyway. And who knew there were 400,000 kids waiting to go to community college in California? Well, there you go. Now they can take these courses, at least the remedial ones. One other topic, and another sensitive one, but Steve brought it up about teaching, and he's absolutely right. I remember when I was at Harvard Law School, there was a student who graduated, who was the valedictorian at Harvard College, talked about, he was very funny, he was an economics major, and he said it was great to go to a university and study economics in the same city where John Kenneth Galbraith lives. He was talking about the fact that he never saw him in 4 years. We have a real perverse, because I've been there, incentive system in higher education. The more successful, famous, and powerful you are, the fewer students you teach. It's another thing that we can change with the technology. Till you get to the really distinguished professors who never see a student at all and just sit on research grants. 20% of the faculty at the University of Texas teaches 60% of the course load. Now, that's inefficient, also not fair. I remember when I taught the introductory course of philosophy at Boston University, my department chairman would thank me for my sacrifice in teaching the freshmen. Hell, that's not a sacrifice. That's the only course that's really fun, is that intro to philosophy. Who am I? Why am I? Why are you? And, but the Amherst faculty can do that, and they can go on a hunger strike, and they can do whatever they want, but don't stand in the doorway, don't block up the halls, because the times are changing, even in Amherst. Even my alma mater, Williams, it'll come there, even to the Berkshires, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Bill. So I just want to throw up a question here for anyone on the panel. Certainly, Patricia, you don't have to answer this, but being in the job that you're in, you probably have some views on it. So why don't the leading private universities just lower their tuition? Instead of having so much fundraising for financial aid, why isn't there some more concerted effort to decrease the sticker price? Could you kind of explain that? And you don't have to, but maybe Steve wants to, or?
I really can't explain it, but I agree with you that I think some things should be done along those lines. Some of you may remember that Sewanee, the University of the South, lowered their tuition a few years ago. And last night I was at a reception with a woman who was the chairman of the board at Sewanee, and she said she thought that by doing so they would set the pace for other schools to begin to look at this, and no, it just didn't happen. I think that schools have been thinking, hoping that the paying customers will come, and they don't want to, quote, leave money on the table. And so they also look at all of the costs, the newer costs associated with running a school, and certainly the cost of maintaining the quality of life for the students at a place like Georgetown, and also to make sure that we have state-of-the-art technology and all of those things. We're driving up the costs, but I firmly believe that we've got to get a handle on this. And I know that we have several places at the university who have been studying this, but the problem is we've studied it long enough. We really have to do something. So we have a new initiative at Georgetown called the Global Social Enterprise Initiative. And a few weeks ago we had a roundtable to discuss just these very issues. And one of the findings of that was that we should see if we can get together a group of college presidents to see if we can make some progress on this. We've got to change the model.
And
Steve?
And you know that because of the Department of Justice, we cannot get, the one thing we cannot do is get together a group of college presidents to talk about limiting tuition, because we cannot talk about the price of our institutions. That was an antitrust case years ago that we've all been, dealing with the consequences of for decades now. Look, we're in a high price, high aid model in private higher education. There's no question about that. The whole premise on which we are built as institutions is that we enable students who otherwise couldn't afford to come to our institutions to do so by charging a higher price to families that can afford those prices. And so there's no question that that is the model, and you can regard it as a social engineering model if you wish to do so, but it is the model on which all these institutions are based. My concern, to go back to something I said earlier, is that that model is being adopted wholesale and extremely rapidly by our public institutions. So it's paradoxical from my point of view to talk about the 3 to 5% increases in private institutions, not on all students, but on the families that can afford it, partly to enable the families that can't afford it to be able to even afford the increases that happen every year just because of inflation. So just to keep up with the rising cost factors, you've got to have an increase that's probably even beyond that cost to be able to afford the financial aid for students who otherwise couldn't afford to come to the institution at all. But I've got some numbers here on public institutions. So during 2011-2012 academic year, average tuition costs at public institutions rose by 8.3%, right? That's about $5,000 per student. At the University of Michigan, it was 6.7%, UC Berkeley, 8%, University of Virginia, 8.9%, Arizona State University, 20%. The University of California system has had a 32% increase in tuition since 2009, and at the same time, state and local funding fell by an average of 9% per student, so it actually fell more than the tuition increase during that same period. California which has its three systems, University of California system, California state system, and the community college system. Those together are the largest public. They comprise. I think it makes up the largest public system in the country. Their student per funding student fell by 14.3% last year. So there was a 14.3% reduction for that whole system in 1 year, taking it down to the lowest level in 25 years. And of course, the way these institutions are going to make up for that is by bringing in international and out-of-state students at higher rates. That's the only way they're going to do it, or else they're going to have to cut their programs, or else they're going to have to cut their enrollments at a very time when we're trying to open access. That's a crisis, okay? The fact that Harvard goes up 4% rather than 3% in a given year is not a crisis for very many people. But what's happening in public institutions, what's happening in the social compact, and the class divide that's widening because of the fraying of that social compact, that's a crisis I think it makes more sense for us to focus on than the question of exactly where we put the sticker price for the small percentage of families that are paying those tuitions at private universities.
Bill, did you have a comment on that?
I think you should have a comment because you study this, and you should talk about the financial health of these public institutions.
Mm-hmm. Well, from our perspective, one of the counterintuitive results of the process that Steve mentioned is that the practices of the private universities are exactly copied by the public universities.
Yeah, they're becoming like us.
So it's a natural reaction, and the public universities today are financially stronger than they were 20 years ago. 20 years ago, half of the budgets of the operating budget of most public universities were funded by their state, 50 to 60% if you go back to around 1990. Now that number's 25%. You would think that these are organizations that would have dramatically cut their services and or found private donations, but they really haven't. The private donations have been a part of the puzzle, but the main shift has been exactly what Steve said. It's raising the cost to in-state, but especially out-of-state students. But from a perspective of the university, they're financially stronger. We've upgraded 5 times as many public universities in the last 20 years from their credit position as downgraded.
Could I just make a point about the poor?
Yes, Bill.
Because this is an important fact. Steve said about the high price model. So you charge the students who can afford a whole lot more, so you have more money available for the poor. But this hasn't worked. That's the problem. 1970, 12% of recent college graduates came from the bottom quartile of the distribution. 40 years later, after all of this, the percentage was 7.3%. The effect of driving these prices and costs up higher and higher and higher has been to discourage a lot of poor people from attending college. And as the New York Times pointed out in an article a week or two ago, there's not really that reach at a lot of the elite institutions, private institutions, a lot of them, not all of them, to students outside of the major cities. They don't hear about this, but this has been the effect. We haven't talked about it much, but I very much believe, and I now think it's been demonstrated by the research, that the huge amount of availability of money has driven up the price of higher education. And colleges say, look, we can charge more, and that'll help poor kids. Parents see the price go up, they go hit the federal government for more money, so we put more money in, price goes up again. It isn't just the rate of inflation for colleges and universities. They've gone up 300% since 1990, which is a lot more than inflation.
Steve, I'm going to give you a chance to respond to what Bill said, but first I want to go to Tony. Tony, you have some comments on this
A
topic?
couple of things. One, I think it's right to look at the dynamics in publics and really realize what's been happening. And so states have been cutting funding, and that really has been what's the fundamental driver of kind of this increasing subsidy and rising list price of tuition. And it's been exacerbated, right? Every time we have a recession, generally kind of enrollment in higher ed is directly correlated with, it's countercyclical. So when you have recessions, you have more people go back and invest, and so it puts a demand. And so at a time when revenues are constrained, you have more demand. And so that puts more, generally what happens when you have recoveries, then states try to make up, and they've never been able to make up. And so that cycle's gotten worse and worse, and so you actually see the per student subsidy continues to come down. And I think that's exactly where we are today. And so I think that's a fundamental issue. And so part of our policy position has been, how can we think about putting incentives so that states don't continue to decrease funding for public higher education? I think the second thing, and I'm going to go back to this point, Bill referenced it, I referenced this earlier, it's this notion of these middle skills jobs. Again, the jobs we're talking about, they pay between $50,000 and $75,000. These are pathways to the middle class. Again, another statistic, 28% with people with an associate's degree make more than the median of people with a bachelor's degree. I think one of the implications of this kind of rising overall tuition is going to be people are going to be looking for alternatives, and they're going to move away from the traditional four-year baccalaureate. And the employer market's going to value that, and that's going to become a better value proposition. And I think that's going to be a dynamic that's going to ultimately, competitive forces are going to be another part of putting pressure on the traditional publics to not keep on raising tuition.
Thank you, Tony. So alternatives to the traditional four-year degree are certainly something on the table, and it looks like it's already changing. Steve, you going to comment to reaction to Bill or what Tony said?
I'll comment briefly on both of them. I mean, I think, first of all, on what Tony said, I think it's great to have alternatives to four-year college for students. I don't think there's any reason that we have to assume that the only way people can succeed in life is by going to a four-year college. And if there are other pathways to careers, I think it's terrific if we can develop those. And I think, we're dealing with this in Washington, D.C. right now. What the city of Washington needs more than anything else is a strong community college. It's been difficult. It's been a real challenge to produce that. And it would make a huge difference to the prospects and the high unemployment rate that we experience in Washington, D.C. So I think I totally support that. I've always been a very strong supporter of community colleges, not just as a pathway to four-year colleges, but as ends in themselves because of the kind of training and skills that they can provide. And frankly, I wish we had more, a more robust technical training system in our high schools, which we used to enjoy in some states and which is almost entirely atrophied. So I completely support that kind of diversification. Don't believe for a moment that everybody needs to get a four-year college degree. But I think the one place where Bill and I probably in all these issues have just a stark disagreement is on this hypothesis that the availability of federal loans has been driving the price of elite private institutions. There's been study after study attempting to confirm that hypothesis. It has been disconfirmed by every single one of those studies. And I will tell you, the availability of federal loans plays zero role in how I think about setting the price or how our Board of Trustees thinks about setting the price at our institution. We look at our costs, we look at the needs for financial aid, we look at what we're trying to do to improve the institution, and on the basis of those, we make our decisions about price. And again, what's driving the price that makes everyone in this nation anxious is not the way things get tweaked at our small number of elite institutions, it's the way, what's happening in those public institutions where the social compact is broken down and they're being defunded by their states, and as a result, they're raising the costs, and that's what's driving this differentiation that I totally agree with Bill on, is a differentiation between what happens to the wealthy and what happens to the poor in this society. So I think that's where the crisis really lies.
Okay, it's good to have disagreement. I just want to, Bill,
No.
yes, go ahead, Bill.
Well, just one sentence. It hasn't been refuted over and over again. It's been confirmed over and over again. Let me just cite one study, but people can do the research themselves. They can look at it.
We will have battling studies at some point.
All right.
See what happens.
But let me just warn you what I'm going to bring up. I'm going to bring up the Golden-Selene study. Golden at Harvard and Selene at George Washington University.
Of course, I agree with everything. Let me just
You
take
agree
my
with
own
everything
case.
he says. That's right.
Bill, the important point is, when I think about what we do every year, we go through every year the process of setting the price. It has never ever come up in that conversation that we're going to raise the price because there's more federal loans available. It's never come up.
No, you raise the price because you can raise the price, and people keep
We
coming.
raised the,
The market will take it.
I think it is to
The
be
market will
disputed.
take
I would say that every year over the last 30 years, tuition has increased. In 11 of those 30 years, Pell Grants, right, have not. And in case one case it went down. So that is factually true. Now you can do
Right.
all the different correlations, but I don't think the evidence is at all convincing and 100% compelling that there's a direct correlation.
Well, Arnie Duncan, you know him, says Bennett may be right, and in fact, tuition goes up willy-nilly. It goes up when federal subsidies are there, and it goes up when federal subsidies are not there, because the public will still pay it. They'll just get grandma out of the old person's home and put her to work to help pay for that tuition. Look, it's a seller's market, and you guys have had it great, but the times are changing.
Well, I think the
that's fine, we can
distinction is
agree on that, but that's not federal loans.
yeah. I think it is important to distinguish between total federal student aid, one, right, which is kind of a student right, if you will, and then Pell Grants, which is a subsidy. And so I think that is clearly a distinction we would make. And so if you said, should we be cutting back Pell Grants, we would argue no. We would argue that for those who are most in need, if we're going to have a vibrant democracy, we need to continue to provide resources to those, especially in an environment where tuitions are increasing. And so I don't think anybody would argue that we should be reducing Pell Grants.
I'd also
You're
like
targeting them better.
I'd also like to remind people that the cost increases at these private institutions serve a very small fraction of our population, relatively speaking. And when people talk about the increasing costs of higher education, they're primarily talking about the 70+% of students that are served by our public institutions. And I think that when we think about where we want to correct the problem, I think we should focus on the 70+% that currently can't afford even a basic college education.
Hear, hear.
Just a thought on that.
Okay, so as moderator, I get the last word before we open up for a few questions. We have about 7 minutes left. I would just tell a little story that we had a teleconference for investors on higher education, and I made the point that Daphne just made, that very, very few students in the country pay the full sticker price for private colleges and universities. And I mentioned in particular the most selective, which would be, say, the top 15, 20 schools in the country, only enroll about 3% of the students. And hardly anyone pays full price as a nation. And even in those 20 schools or so, it's a fairly small share now that pay full price due to financial aid strategies and other student diversification strategies. So I got a call from our chief credit officer afterwards from a head of research at a Wall Street firm. And I'm a tax exempt market muni guy, so in Wall Street I'm not high on the pecking order of Sears. So the head of research calls our chief credit officer in my line of business and said, "Who is this Nelson guy? What is he talking about? He said hardly anybody pays full price at these elite private schools, but I asked all of my friends who I work with, and they're all paying the full price." So with that,
That's right.
I just want to open it up to questions. We do have a microphone, and we have the first question. Yes.
Hi, Megan Smith from Google. I'm also on the MIT board, and I wanted to share a quick thing and get your comments about it. The new president of MIT, Raphael Reif, has divided the disruption into 3 areas. And so we're incredibly excited about what's happening. The first is the instruction area, Daphne, that you guys are doing such an awesome job on, which we think is completely disrupting, and we hope that the lecture halls are disappearing on our campus in that form, and that they'll turn into what we think is the second area, which we actually think there's a huge opportunity for campuses for what we think is the collaborative community around labs, projects, theater, philosophy, debate, that this is a gathering point for communities. Edwin Land in the 50s gave a watershed lecture at MIT about how you should think of Da Vinci's lab and getting to go join that in the community. So we think there's this massive D-school-like, D-lab-like place that happens. And the third area is entrepreneurship, that the Peter Thiel versus the university argument is a false dichotomy, that the students actually want to do entrepreneurial, real-world things during their learning, and that the campus, if it turns into the lab environment, could be the better place because they would have research and community and learning opportunities while they're also impacting the real world. And I'd note for that example that Berkeley's #1 minor today is development. The students are doing real world projects. It's their most popular minor along all their courseware. So we think that the lab, Fab Lab, Media Lab, D-School, Stanford-like environment is what all the community colleges become, and that it's a wonderful future.
Thank you very much. So that was a very positive view of the disruption that's going to happen.
Hi, John
Brett.
Graff from Reason Foundation. I have a quick question for any of the panelists. What is the process for educating businesses to take the formal degree out of the hiring process?
You're starting to see some of that happening now with the emergence of some of these job matching sites, kind of the capabilities of LinkedIn, Indeed, and others. Algorithms are being developed that are kind of increasingly matching a set of either credentials or competencies based on experience to job requirements. And I think we're at the cusp of some significant work. Part of the problem is there are no real intermediaries. And so I think there's a lack of intermediaries, and that's what's prohibiting it right now, because it needs to be done more on a sector basis than on an individual company basis. But I think you're seeing some models emerge. I would expect that's going to change over the next 5 years.
Thank you, John.
Hi
Next
there.
question.
Yeah, I sent both my sons to college not to get their degrees in physics and psychology as they did, because neither of them got jobs as a result, but to become adults. And what I was hoping they'd do is develop their character. And instead, what they found at college was a great opportunity to experiment with premarital sex, underage drinking, and illegal drugs. And so my question is, isn't one value of a sleepaway college an opportunity to be mentored into adulthood? I mean, actually, my freshman year in college, in the third week I went into a crisis and had a philosophy professor who grabbed me and said, "You're having an existential crisis." And that's what education's about. You can measure your progress in terms of the number of beliefs that you abandon and replace with doubt or perhaps new beliefs. And he guided me through that, whereas today, I noticed in my son's college, just a long line outside the the mental health clinic to get antidepressants instead. So where's the role of
I think that's my question.
character?
So
Take that as a question.
Steve,
Yeah.
please.
So take it as a question. I mean, I think that this is the one thing that worries me about the current, some of the things we're hearing from the Department of Education at the moment is this notion that you're going to sort of rate degree programs or rate subject matter by the job prospects that it leads to. I worry about that because I think that the unpredictability of the college experience is one of its great strengths. That is, students come to college not having any idea what subject is going to ignite their passions, what career opportunities are going to be opened up to them, and it's the diversity of universities and what they have to offer that I think provides the opportunities for that kind of existential encounter that was just described by the questioner. I'd like to see us preserve that as a strong feature of American higher education, which, by the way, is envied by systems abroad because it does lead to creative opportunities that other educational systems around the globe are hankering after.
Well, what you're hoping for just doesn't go on very much unless you're interested in a Christian college or religious college of some sort. Remember the student at Columbia who said the motto of Columbia was learning, virtue, and piety? He said, I got a little of the first, very little of the second, and the third was never mentioned at all. I mean, forget it. And remember why Harvard was founded. Look, all this stuff about these Ivy League institutions, and they're small and they don't make that much difference, the hell they don't. These are powerful institutions, and all the other institutions want to be like them. You know, this is what Harold Rosenberg called intellectuals, a herd of independent minds, you know. And they want. I heard a chancellor of a public university yesterday stand up and proudly announce his selectivity was almost as great as Princeton's. Well, bully for you. The problem is you're running a public university, you son of a gun, you know, and it's about the public. Now, you can, as Steve pointed out earlier, when they divided up the California system, there was supposed to be a division of labor. That some would be doing something, some would be doing ag, some would be doing philosophy. But the tendency of these institutions is to grow in all directions. But the search for character, it's in the book. I can tell you some institutions you send your child to. One of the military academies might not have been a bad idea. They still believe in that there.
I agree.
Right, but you will search in vain, it seems to me, at a lot of institutions. I had this debate with Derek Bach, because I was a proctor in the Harvard Yard. I said, can't we take a stand on some of this stuff? Can't we? So in loco parentis. You know, in
So,
loco
Steve,
parentis.
I
we don't do
apologize.
that anymore. I'm sorry.
I need to-
I know you need to cut us off, but let me just say, we've got 1,000 student veterans right now who are providing a great deal of leadership and character in our student body. They are leading the rest of our students in service, and that's changing pretty quickly.
That concludes the session. I want to thank you very much. I do have one housekeeping item. For anyone who's interested in Bill's book, Is College Worth It? There's a book signing at 10:45 in the bookstore at Pavilion. Thank you very much.